This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. If you like us, please join our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find it on the homepage. I'm Dahlia Shenlin, speaking to you from Jerusalem, without Gilad Halpern this time. Every week, we talk about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. I'm pleased to be speaking today with someone whose work I've admired for a long time. Mustafa Akyol is a Turkish journalist and author. He writes regular opinion columns for the New York Times since 2013. He's a regular contributing opinion writer. He's also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute's Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. He's published 6 books in Turkish, including one on the Kurdish issue, and 2 in English. Islam Without Extremes, a Muslim Case for Liberty in 2011, which was banned in Malaysia and actually got him arrested there. And in 2017, the most recent one, The Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims, published by St. Martin's Press. Mustafa Akyol, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Dahlia. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
There's a lot of talk in recent years about how Islam is misperceived in the West. I want to start out by asking you, do you think there are ways that Islam is misinterpreted or misperceived by Muslims themselves?
Well, that's my argument in Islam Without Extremes. Of course, then I offer an alternative argument, and other people think that you are misinterpreting. But since we don't have a pope in Islam, there's no central authority who can say this is the right form of the faith. Well, in Islam Without Extremes, I try to highlight a fundamental problem I see in the Muslim world today. What is that problem? Well, some people will say extremism, extremism, violent extremism is of course a huge problem, but that's also a marginal problem. I mean, the Muslims who would sympathize with Al-Qaeda, ISIS, these are a very small group of people. So these extremists, they threaten other Muslims, they are banned in Muslim countries, so overwhelming majority of Muslims are against these, violent, vicious terrorist groups.
And let me just ask you, are there more such violent extremists in Islam than in any other religion?
Currently, maybe, but not necessarily historically. I mean, while Christians had crusades and Inquisition and pretty violent history and persecution of Jews, by the way, also for centuries, yeah. But, Christianity, especially Western Christianity, made its peace with liberal values, with democracy, with freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And it wasn't easy. I mean, the Catholic Church only in the 1960s accepted the idea of religious freedom in full. Before that, they were banning, the deviant books and all that. So there has been an evolution. Judaism had the Jewish Enlightenment, Haskalah, which I value a lot because I think it's very relevant to some of our issues. And in Islam, we have not yet fully, at least in all parts of the Muslim world, have come to that stage of, okay, let's accept these rational universal values and reinterpret our tradition. I think we need to do that. And we are on the brink of maybe doing that in some Muslim societies. And that's a battle that I want to be, a part of. And so Islam Without Extremes is not just about extremism. It's actually the subtitle, a Muslim Case for Liberty. So I wanted to emphasize the matter of freedom. Do we have enough freedom in Muslim world? We don't. How can we move forward? How can we accept freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and reinterpret aspects of Islam that seem to clash with these values?
Well, what I find interesting is it comes out of your account of how Turkey under Ataturk famously executed what almost was like a great leap forward to eradicate Islam from public life. And you also point out the commonalities with communism and the attempt to eradicate religion. But what he generally did then was create an ongoing battle, in a way, between religion and the illiberal, authoritarian repression or suppression of religion. Why, at the time, was there no option for a liberal approach to removing religion from the public sphere?
Well, there was. I mean, actually, regarding Turkey, a lot of people, especially in the West, have this dichotomy in their mind. There is the backward, dark woman oppressing Islam. And then came these brilliant leaders like Ataturk who suppressed all that. But unfortunately, Islam is coming back today, so that's really bad. That's a narrative you would have about Iran, about Turkey, and some other countries in the Middle East. Well, one of my arguments is that, it's not that simple. And because the Ataturk model in Turkey, Ataturk is the founder of my country. I respect him for winning the War of Liberation and all that. But the model he brought was an illiberal secularism that also was too much zealous against religion, inspired by French laïcité, which went further than that. And the implication of that, for example, was banning Muslim women wearing a headscarf and going to the campus. Well, you can wear a headscarf and go to a campus in any free country in the world. You can do it in America, you can do it in Israel, but you couldn't do it in Turkey. So it was an excessive secularism, which was, I think, the wrong remedy. The right remedy would be to, open up space for the secular people. Bring some Enlightenment ideas, but also respect religious freedom. So do not persecute religious freedom. Religious people. Do not suppress traditional religious people. Just try to introduce an open space that new ideas can be discussed. And I think when you bring some oppressive secularism, you have a backlash against that. In Iran, that was very dramatic. In Turkey, it's less dramatic, but it is happening now.
And you also point out that you think it's responsible, to some extent, this repressive authoritarian version of religion is leading people to leave the faith.
Exactly, because I think both of these models, look at Iran. Under the first Shah, the headscarf was banned even on the streets. And that gave you what? Well, after several decades, it culminated into the Khomeini revolution, and you had the Islamic Republic of Iran, which now forces all women to cover their heads, not uncover them. So you have these two models that are authoritarian in their own ways. And you might still prefer the secular one if you're a more secular person, but to me, this is a vicious cycle and the two sides of the same coin. And I argue for a true liberalism, which includes religious freedom, but it includes freedom from religion as well.
But I'm still interested to go back a little bit to Ataturk. You give him, to a certain extent, credit for inspiring other parts of the Middle East, particularly also the Shah's regime, and presumably the Sunni Arab states as well, in terms of adopting this idea that in order to modernize as states, they had to not only separate religion, but also move into being a society that is not democratic at all. Is this a historic accident, or was there a purposeful reason for this more authoritarian, illiberal approach in the early years of independent statehood, of modern statehood?
Now you're asking me about a big dilemma.
Yes.
You had these pre-modern societies, right? Not industrialized enough, not educated enough, and compared to the West, they have been lagging behind, in the early 19th century, let's say late 19th century and early 20th century. But there is something I also tell in my book. There was some Ottoman modernization. The Tanzimat reforms that began in the mid-19th century, 1839 to pinpoint the date, which initiated some democratization in the Ottoman Empire. It led to an elected parliament. It gave equal rights to Jews and Christians, which is, a big issue in classical Islam. They were not dhimmis anymore. They were equal citizens of the empire. So these reforms, apostasy laws have been annulled. So there were important changes in the Ottoman Empire and important modernization as well. And I would like to see that going, like a modernization that is more respectful to tradition, but also bringing new aspects. And what Ataturk did was brought a more radical top-down modernization. And not even modernization, but distinctively cultural westernization. One of Ataturk's, iconic and, to me, tragic reforms is that he brought the hat revolution, as we would call it. Like the fez, Ottoman fez was banned, and people were forced to wear
What did you call it? The brim hat?
The brimmed hat. Yeah. You should wear there are stories in Istanbul, some men, you had to wear it by law. And there are photos of men wearing female lady hats because they didn't know what's the difference between a male and a female hat.
And then when there was some protest against this, some critique of it, but then people were arrested for
People were arrested for it. There have
right?
been people who executed for this. And, that is not exactly the kind of modernization I would like to see. What I would like to see is, free press, economic modernization for sure, and certainly curb the religious groups that are willing to oppress, other parts of society, but also allow them. And you know what? Actually, Israel has done that. I admire that part of Israel. You have the Haredim. I'm not a big expert on Israel, but as far as I can see, you have the Haredim, you have very conservative Israelis. There's a whole spectrum there. Some of them even don't recognize the legitimacy of the state because of their certain religious beliefs, but the state still recognizes them and respects them. And then there you have secular Jews, you have Tel Aviv, you have, a totally secular scene as well. And I think that diversity, I know it's hard to keep it going, but I think that diversity is probably healthier than having either a theocratic republic or a secular republic that suppresses religion.
Well, I dare say, I mean, since you brought it up, that Israel finds itself in a sort of ongoing 72-year-long negotiation about this very thing, because no side is ever completely satisfied with the balance. And I think what it sounds to me like what you're trying to do in this book is open up the possibility of having that kind of a negotiation.
Well, negotiation is the perfect thing. I mean, we want more of that. In Turkey, what we rather had was, especially during the Republican era, I mean, one side captured power and designed a republic for its own taste and for its own cultural values. The secularists had that for for about a century, and now the religious conservatives in Turkey have the upper hand under President Erdogan.
And so it's always a pendulum swing. Do you think it's swinging any closer to the middle?
Well, in Turkey, we have not been there yet. But for example, Tunisia seems to be succeeding in that. I'm optimistic about Tunisia, the only country that, turned the Arab Spring into a successful model. Their Islamists and secularists have been able to make a pretty liberal constitution together without condemning each other as traitors. And
is that to some extent the key to understanding where the Arab Revolution could have gone in order to be successful, is putting together a better framework of negotiation for the relationship between religion and state?
Exactly. And those negotiations, I mean, in Tunisia, concessions as well, and a consensus based on concessions. That is a political process. So you need political wisdom for that. And Islamic groups, for example, will have to step back from the idea that alcohol should be banned. Well, don't drink your alcohol. I mean, not your alcohol. Don't touch it if you don't. If it's haram, don't touch it. But, well, some citizens like to enjoy it, so respect that, as they will respect your abaya or your hijab or your whatever. So how do you come to that? Well, there is some political negotiation into this, but I also believe, regarding Islamic law in the Sunni tradition, you need some reinterpretations. I mean, if you have a Sharia or a fiqh, a interpretation of Sharia, which tells you that you should ban public sin in the public square, it's your religious duty, or you should really kill apostates, or you should really flog blasphemers, well, then there will be a zeal to do that. And for political reasons, you might take a step back, but it can come back. So therefore, there is, in the whole transformation of the Islamic tradition, there's a matter of pragmatism, politics and all that, but there needs to be some rethinking of jurisprudential issues, which actually triggers rethinking of some theological issues in Islam. And that's my first book is about, and my next book will be about that too.
I want to talk about another, actually your second book, which I think, you can tell me if I'm completely wrong, your recent book, The Islamic Jesus, I read it in a way as one of your answers to the first book, because it seemed to me that the entire book, is largely about ancient Judaism and the origins of Christianity and Islam, the borrowings, the influences, the parallels. It seems to me that you could read this as a way of saying this is how we should experience our religion, as having roots, connections with other religions, things in common with them. We have interactive relationships, complementary relationships rather than combative relationships. Am I completely reading that into it, or would you say that's part of what you were trying to do?
You're reading it wonderfully, and thanks so much. And thanks for reading the book too. And well, one thing I want to do is to, reopen some discussions in Islam about theological issues, about jurisprudential issues. And I'm not an imam or like sheikh who can have a mufti or give a fatwa. But as a writer, I'm trying to refer to some Islamic authorities we didn't maybe pay attention enough and had these interesting ideas and bring them to the public attention. But this is one thing what I do. But the other thing, and these two things are connected, is to show Muslims and non-Muslims that Islam is a religion deeply connected with its Abrahamic, sisters, Judaism and Christianity. I actually think it's more connected to Judaism more than anything else. Islam is, historically speaking, a continuation of Judaism, or an extension of Judaism to Gentiles, if I can say. Well, let me put it this way. For me, Islam is Abrahamic monotheism for Gentiles. And I'm a Gentile, but, I became an honorable Abrahamic person.
So we can call you a member of the tribe?
Yeah, I joined the tribe, so we are Semites in that sense. Well, in the book, The Islamic Jesus, and by the way, the subtitle might, raise some questions. I said how the king of the Jews became a prophet of the Muslims.
It did raise lots of questions, which is why it's worth reading.
Jews don't see Jesus as king of the Jews, and of course, I don't mean that he was the king of the Jews. As far as we can tell, Jesus was a Jew who claimed to be the Messiah in first century Judea. Of course, he wasn't the Messiah for Jews today. But, that was his movement. And when the Romans were crucifying him, they wrote on his crucifix, King of the Jews as a pun as a mockery. And, that title is there in the New Testament. So I use it just for that. And what I wanted to emphasize was that Islam has a very interesting position on Jesus. On the one hand, there's great respect in the Quran for Mary and Jesus. The virgin birth of Jesus is narrated and fully accepted. So on that sense, Islam and Christianity seems very close. Jesus is repeatedly called the Messiah. But on the other hand, Islam strongly renounces the idea that Jesus is divine Messiah.
That's a pretty big difference.
That's a big difference. Still, so Islam rejects Trinity. Islam is just like Judaism in its very strict monotheism. So God is one, and there's no triune, nature of God. And Jesus is God's creature. He's not God himself. Now, this is an interesting middle position between Judaism and Christianity. Because, in Judaism, Jesus is not seen as an important figure, right? He was one Jew maybe with some eccentric ideas, Jews, but actually...
Or at least the Jews who saw him that way left.
Yeah, and even there are some negative attitudes towards Jesus because of the persecution of Jews by Christians and throughout history and so on and so forth. So Islam, distances itself from this, honors Jesus greatly. But on the other hand, it distances itself from Christianity and saying that, no, well, we respect Jesus as the Messiah, but he wasn't divine. Now, this is an interesting middle position, and you can just say, well, Muslims found some, midpoint between the two faiths. That's interesting. But when you look into the history of early Christianity, this midpoint becomes more interesting. Because as we know from the writings of church fathers, there were groups in the first 3 centuries of Christianity which took the exact same position. In other words, they saw Jesus as a human Messiah. And these people were Jews. Not mainstream Jews, obviously, but they were practicing Jews who thought Jesus came as the Mashiach, the Messiah, but the Jewish Messiah, not as a divine Christ.
So Jews who actually believed in him just the way in later centuries some Jews would follow
Sabbatai Zevi, yeah. Imagine the Jews who follow Sabbatai Zevi, which, who became then, to hide themselves, they created another whole, let's say, faction within or maybe outside of Judaism. I don't want to judge here. But imagine, here's a Jewish Messiah movement, and some Jews believed in that. And they're known as Jewish Christians by the academic.
And so what's the connection with that back to Islam? Why do you focus on that in the book?
The connection is the image of Jesus held by Jewish Christians is exactly the image of Jesus that is in the Quran.
I have to say, I find this very interesting, and I'm going to point out one of the more interesting stories that I think is in your book. You also wrote about it separately, which is the alternate nativity story. And you talk about this alternate nativity story in which Jesus is not born in the manger in Bethlehem, but in the wilderness under a palm tree. God appears and brings Mary a stream. A Jewish person cannot help, I think, but think of the parallels to the story of Hagar, Abraham's wife, who's the mother of Ishmael. He's dying in the desert. God or angels appear and give them water. Do you think this is consciously connected in a way that the Quran or the Muslim reading is saying, well, we have this connection to the Tanakh stories?
Wow, you really read my book and carefully and meticulously, and I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Well, in the Quran, there are stories about Jesus that are sometimes very similar to the New Testament Gospels. Like the Annunciation, angel comes to Mary and says, you will have a blessed son, and she becomes pregnant without any human touch. So that is in the Quran. That's very much similar. But then there are parts of the Quran about Jesus that, diverge from the New Testament. They tell things that there are not in the New Testament, which is puzzling to Western Christians. But some of those things are in Eastern Gospels that didn't make itself to the New Testament, that Christians call apocryphal, So some stories are there. There are even a few other things, as you mentioned. Like, according to the Quran, Mary gave birth to Jesus, not in a barn in Bethlehem, but somewhere in the wilderness. Yep. Which, yes, very much reminds of the Hagar story. And there could be a, echo there. But there's another thing. Well, your authorities, the Israeli authorities, excavated a Byzantine church between Jerusalem and Bethlehem in the 90s, the Kathisma Church. And that church has some signs that are very similar to the Quranic narrative about the birth of Jesus. Like what? Well, according to the Quran, Mary in the wilderness sat down and under a palm tree which had dates, and the water came up, miraculous water. She drank from that, and she ate from the dates. And Jesus was born, and then an angel, actually said, don't worry, and so on and so forth. And well, this church, this Kathisma church, has mosaics. And by the way, it's Kathisma of Theotokos, so the place of God-bearer. So it's a church dedicated to Mary.
God-bearer being reference to Mary.
Mary, which is, of course, heretical for you and me. I mean, as a Christian term, let's say. We respect their terms, but, it's not our terms. This is a church dedicated to Mary. In the mosaics, when you, look at the bottom of the church, there's one big mosaic. Wow, what is that? Here's a palm tree filled with dates. And there are historical reports about this church that, there were a stream there, people were drinking from it, the pilgrims, and so on and so forth. So one of Quran's narratives about Mary resonates with a alternative Christian tradition, which places the birth of Jesus not in Bethlehem, but in the wilderness between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. So, wow. So there are some, and how do you interpret this? Non-Muslims can say, well, it's obvious that the Quran, it was influenced by certain Christian legends. A Muslim can say, well, our truth is in the Quran. But you see, even Christians knew of that a little bit, but maybe they rejected it. Theological positions can change, but I wanted to show that, wow, our religions are very connected. And these three great religions are connected.
Well, I want to just point out that you said it might be heretical to use this term God-bearer to refer to Mary. And I'm thinking about the fact that, I studied religion, right, for my BA and my master's. So I'm used to the academic study of religion. And the academic study of religion, we do these kinds of comparisons all the time. But practitioners of religion, believers, don't always want to admit that there's things in common and what we might call anthropological parallels. Do you hope to be kind of a bridge between what the academics have long acknowledged and believers who can maybe come to understand that there's things in common?
Again, that's a very good, definition of what I'm trying to do. There is a lot of interesting information in academia, which doesn't always make its way to, the public information. I collect those interesting facts and put them, and I say, well, you can still look at this and keep your theology, because, you can say, well, everything the Quran says is absolutely true, divinely given. And, of course, normal that, there are precedents of that story in somewhere else. Or a non-Muslim can say, this is all, accumulated information. And people can look in different ways. But once you start to see that, well, we are connected, even if my religion is true, you start to see the other side maybe not that negatively. And that's something I want to do. I want to do it regarding Islam and Judaism too.
Right. It seems like all religions could use a little bit of this.
And honestly, I think Islam is more connected to Judaism more than any other religion. We are speaking of Sharia. Well, it's coming from the halakha. You stopped, implementing the penal code 2,000 years ago, and that saved you from a lot of trouble.
But we still draw on Jewish law here in Israel, and some people don't think that's such a good thing. It depends on where you stand. I want to ask you, there seems to be a sort of emerging generation of voices who are thoughtful, critical, academic, at least in English. Both Reza Aslan and Harun Mughal have been on our show, and people like Irshad Manji. Do you see yourself as part of a trend of Muslims speaking in English to Western audiences? I don't know if that's coincidental, but explicitly or implicitly calling for a liberal, critical approach? Is this a group, a trend? I didn't mean to say trend.
Yeah.
Is this coming out of some need, and being represented by this young generation?
I guess so. Some of the people you mentioned are my friends, Reza and Harun especially. I admire their work. We have differences. I'm more into renewal, reinterpretation of Islam. Reza is just more into, religion in the modern world and maybe just religions in general. And, everybody has a different take. And, for example, Reza's book on Jesus is more of a more secular book. I think my book is a really more book with a religious angle.
Is it intended for Muslims or is it intended for non-Muslim audiences?
Both. I always intend for both.
Okay.
There can be certain issues or like columns or ideas or things that are specifically for some audience. But when I write a book like Islamic Jesus or Islamic Case for Liberty, I intend for both in the sense that Muslims can have new ideas thanks to this book, and they can say, wow, we can look at these issues in a new way, and this Mustafa guy says something interesting. And I want some non-Muslims to understand the diversity in Islam, the potential in Islam for, adopting to the modern world, the contributions of Islam to modern world.
So let me ask you what might be a provocative question. Why is it that people like you are embraced by the conservative establishment, whereas, for example, Jewish people who have a reformist attitude towards Judaism are embraced by the liberal establishment? Is there a real criticism there? Is there a tension or a hypocrisy in saying, well, wait a second, I want to be a liberal reformer of Islam and then I'm being embraced by the conservatives? Or do you not agree? Do you think liberals embrace what you have to say just as much?
I don't think special people embrace me. I mean,
Well, you're with the Cato Institute, however you characterize them.
Cato Institute is a libertarian institute. It's not conservative.
Some would say that.
Yeah, I mean, Cato is a dedicated libertarian institute. And my path to Cato has been, I think, made possible because of my emphasis on freedom, the need for freedom in Islam. I mean, and I think that's a message that will appeal to both conservatives or liberals in America. The only thing, so I don't think I'm embraced by any particular group in the U.S. Well, I'm embraced by the Cato Institute, which is libertarian. And I find myself libertarian, basically, on most issues. But sometimes conservatives, because they're religious, are more interested in discussions about religion. Whereas sometimes liberals just think, well, religion is just a, cover for other deep motives of economy and so on and so forth.
And you don't feel like conservatives are interested because some are against Islam or actually
some are,
Islamophobic?
and I think I don't like those conservatives. I mean, the Islamophobic conservatives. But if you're asking me about the conservatives in America, for example, I have a lot of friends in the conservative universe in America, and these are thoughtful conservatives who are religious Catholics or Protestants, but who want to understand Islam, who want to build bridges, and who want to hear more about the nuances of Islam. So these are the people I feel close to, but not Islamophobic ones.
You're saying it's more meaningful in a way because they also have a religious side that they're balancing with their political attitudes.
Yeah, if a person is not interested in religion at all, I will still have a great conversation about a person about civil liberties and so on and so forth. But when I start to get into the theology that we can use to, articulate these things, that person will maybe not find it that very interesting.
Their eyes might glaze over.
Yeah, they can say, well, let's forget about religion, right?
Right.
I can say, well, you have the right to forget about religion. I fully support your right, but a lot of people will not. And I'm a religious person, and I still think that I have to reconcile certain ideas I have that are liberal ideas or libertarian ideas, how you call them, progressive ideas, but with my theological belief.
Well, I have to say, I think you're right, because nobody has managed to eradicate religion from the world, and maybe we should stop trying and think about ways to reconcile religion in the modern world.
And religion has been eradicated in certain segments of world history, and the results were not always great. You had Mao, you had Stalin, and not all secular movements went bad, but secularism by itself. But North Korea is a pretty secular country right now.
Things aren't working out so well for them.
Well, it's not a free country, and that's my main concern.
Mustafa Akyol, concerned with freedom everywhere, author of many books and a regular New York Times commentator. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, press write a review, and then write one. You can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing to our Patreon campaign, where we have lots of gifts and perks for you. Check out our archive with almost 500 interviews. Please like us on Facebook, the Tel Aviv Review podcast, Ideas from Israel, and follow us on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.